When the torpedoes finally started exploding, Japan's economy stopped. The submarine war of 1943 to 1945 strangled the empire's lifelines and turned victory plans into starvation schedules. Severing the arteries begins at the moment when Japan is still celebrating its first successes, and the United States is already quietly changing the rules of the game. On December 7, 1941, almost in sync with the strike on Pearl Harbor, Washington issues a low-key but fateful order. Wage an unrestricted submarine war against the empire of Yamato's merchant shipping. No more prize rules, warning shots, or humanitarian rituals in the spirit of pre-war conventions. The cargo bound for Japanese factories and garrisons is equated with a military target. Thus, out of the strategic shadows steps the cheap weapon of blockade. Submarines. Fewer than one might wish at that moment, but enough to dismantle the enemy's logistics brick by brick. The first hunting vector is obvious. The arteries from Formosa to Kyushu and Honshu. The warm, noisy, overloaded South China and Java seas. The straits where merchant ships are forced into narrow corridors. From bases in the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies, the first American boats push out. Heavy porpoises and old S-boats. They meet imperial transports carrying oil from Borneo and Sumatra. Ore, rice, rubber, coal. Everything that composes the steel pulse of a war economy. But this initial aiming campaign turns out not to be a thunderous salvo, but a series of jittery clicks. Torpedoes run, wakes vanish. The target keeps going. And there is no explosion. The reason, shameful and stubborn, is called the Mark 14. On paper, it is a perfect torpedo with dual fusing. The magnetic exploder should detonate under the keel and break a ship's back, while the contact exploder should detonate on a direct hit. In practice, the Mark 14 runs deeper than set, as if trying to slip under the target. The magnetic gear listens to the sky rather than the steel, and goes off prematurely from random fluctuations. And the contact exploder loves to turn an ideal 90-degree impact into a dull shove. A thud without detonation. Commanders watch hits through their periscopes and dejectedly write in their logs, targets continue on course. If you truly enjoy stories like these, please hit like. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And please watch the video too. The end. In 1942, this is a systemic ulcer. The boats operate boldly but shoot blanks. Complaints pile up by the folder. Hits without blasts. Miraculous misses. Odd splashes well away from the hull. And then the human factor enters. The Bureau of Ordnance, BUORD, defends the torpedo's reputation for far too long, writing failures off to firing errors and observer psychology. The fleet seethes. Staffs grind their teeth. Only by mid-1943, after a series of painfully public tests in the Pacific, do illusions end. On June 24, Admiral Chester Nimitz issues a short, surgically precise order. Disable the magnetic exploders. At the same time, they correct depth-setting calibration. Torpedoes finally run at the depths they're set to, and they redesign the contact pistol, strengthening the striker system and changing the small part that sheared off on a perfect hit. That bundle of fixes turns the Mark 14 from a burden into a weapon. And in Japan's logistics, one can finally hear a characteristic crack. While torpedo truths were beaten out through scandals and tests, the first year at sea was sluggish for reasons beyond technology. A doctrine of caution lingered from pre-war exercises. Commanders feared surface night attacks, preferred ideal periscope depth shots, and took it as a rule not to risk much for a big reward. SJ radar was not yet standard. Targets had to be hunted by ear and luck. Links to shore, intercepts, and decrypts of convoy schedules were only ramping up. Ultra had not yet handed boats the full key ring. In short, the instrumental and psychological ballast of the past dragged things down. Even so, by late 1942, experience and anger began to turn into momentum. Boats more often slashed the night on the surface, used dark silhouettes and speed, and picked off loner freighters in narrow straits. On the other side stood Japan's ASW, anti-submarine warfare, which, behind a facade of discipline, concealed a strategic underestimation of the problem. The Japanese Navy was raised on the cult of the decisive battle and on dashing operational gambits, not on the day-to-day drudgery of guarding coastal trade. The merchant marine was civilian, its protection secondary, while the best destroyers were needed to screen carrier task forces and fight for Guadalcanal. The result was a late start on a proper convoy system. In 1942, transports often sailed alone, or in small, poorly organized groups. Escorts were ad hoc, mostly old destroyers, converted minesweepers, small auxiliaries. ASW aviation was rare, ranges were short, radars almost non-existent, trained crews rarer still. Add to this the fragmentation of headquarters. The Army and Navy argued over control of tonnage. Routes were allocated in meetings where the logic of frontline urgency trumped the logic of systemic safety. The Navy Ministry handled one piece, the Army's Transport Service another, and a unified convoy brain formed late and cautiously. Even where protection was organized, depth charges were ineffective. Early settings were for shallow depths, while American boats dropped deeper. Hydrophones and sonars, the Japanese Type 93 and its arrays, lagged Western quality, and counterattack. Tactics were formulaic and brief, with no patient pursuit. Geography worked against the Japanese. To connect the oil of Borneo and Sumatra with Nagasaki and Kobe, you had to pass through narrow throats, Makassar, Lombok, the Molucca Sea, the Taiwan Strait. There, the submarines found what they wanted, forced predictability. But to turn predictability into rout, you needed one more ingredient: mass hits. That is precisely what the cursed Mark 14 delayed. Hence, the first year of the war looks like a rehearsal for the grand blockade. Blows are struck, logistics are irritated but not crushed. Japanese plants still receive ore. Tankers, though with losses, still break through. Garrisons in New Guinea and Burma are supplied with effort, yet supplied. Meanwhile, the Americans do two key homework assignments. First, they accelerate the torpedoes' fix-up and saturate boats with radar. Radar is not just eyes in the dark, it's a change in tactics. Surface night attacks become the norm, ranges shrink, accuracy rises. Second, the culture of submarine command shifts. On stage come the officers who will make 1943 the year of the turning point. Hard on themselves, daring toward the enemy. Their approach is simple. Search, overhaul, strike at the first workable chance without waiting for perfect angles, and don't let a convoy go after the first attack. Japan's response also begins to crystallize. Specialized escorts are created. Regular convoys appear on the main routes. Control of straits tightens. But the opening gap has already happened. While Tokyo is building its system, the Americans cure their childhood diseases and set the lever firmly against the arteries. Convoy rollout is delayed just long enough for submarines to grow sharper teeth and for intelligence to map the merchant fleet's habits. By early 1943, two trend lines cross. The U.S. has a fixed torpedo, growing experience, and better tech. Japan has growing needs and still loose, overburdened ASW. The turning point is the moment when the submarine war stops being a string of annoying accidents and turns into a craft with well-tuned tools. Fixing the Mark 14 wasn't just an engineering event. It was a psychological click. Crews stopped doubting their own eyes and began firing with the confidence that a hit would mean an explosion, not a dull thud. By the summer of 1943, the magnetic exploders were switched off, depth settings corrected, the contact pistol redesigned. The practice of surface night attacks, backed by SJ radar, became a system. From that moment, the statistical line bent upward, while Japan's capabilities bent down. The key tactical evolution of the year was the coordinated group, the American take on the Wolfpack. Instead of a lone knight of fortune, a linked pack of boats went to sea and staged the hunt as a series of passes. One would spook the convoy. Another would intercept on the next arc. A third would finish off the stragglers. Commanders spoke a common language, radio reports, standard procedures, unified rules for target allocation. SJ radar gave them night vision. Mark the target, calculate the course, spin the deflection instantly on the TDC, and the boat, like a long-legged predator, would sprint ahead on the surface to strike the lead ship broadside. If the convoy tried to escape with zigzags, the group cut the corners. If the screen pressed for contact, one boat drew the escorts off, giving her partner a firing window. And all of this unfolded under a radio intelligence umbrella. Decrypts and intercepts of schedules, call signs, weather, sailing reports. The operations center, the notional brain of the hunt, pulled the threads into a single picture. Where a convoy was expected, how many escorts it had, how it had changed course last week, who covered it from the air and from where. The geography of 1943 was a web of arteries where every ridge on the map became a tactical chance. The Borneo-Manila-Singapore oil route was the spine. Japanese industry soaked up fuel from Borneo and Sumatra, pumped it through the gates of the South China Sea, then hauled it along Formosa toward the home islands. Any narrowness, the Makassar Strait, the Lombok Corridor, the passes near Palau, made movement predictable, and predictability was a death sentence. Alongside oil went ore and rubber. In the opposite direction, coal, rice, flour, fish, the staples that propped up cities and garrisons. The coal shuttles from northern Kyushu to Honshu and back were the domestic bloodstream. They received more cover, but the cover was thin. Destroyers were needed by the fleet. ASW aviation was thinning out, and specialized escorts and radar were still scarce in Japan. At the tactical level, every detail of 1943 added a few percentage points to luck. SJ radar could pick out pinches of foam on a wave crest, and silhouettes at distances where before, you had to sniff in the dark. Japanese hydrophones and sonars still lagged, and depth charges were often set shallow. Americans dropped to 300 feet and deeper, slipped away down the wake, broke pursuit with oil slicks and noise-making maneuvers, shook off the hunt after a short duel and then regained the convoy's course, refusing to release it until dawn. More and more often commanders chose to hit not the ship's belly, but its logic. Knock out the tanker, smash the leader's rudder gear, trap the convoy in a narrows where it couldn't maneuver, then take the stragglers. Shoot the column's brain. That was the formula of 1943. Americans also changed the war's rhetorical mode. Boats were not just hunters, but reporters of traffic. Every observation, course, speed, composition, zigzag pattern, went ashore, where a map of the next hunt was sketched. The staff in turn fed back tasking. Such and such convoy is moving, likely with oil and ore, route through such and such gate. With the ridiculous torpedo of the early years, this architecture would have been empty noise. With the fixed Mark 14, it became a network of cause-and-effect strikes. Japan answered by creating more regular convoys, launching the first series-built escorts, and beefing up patrols in key straits. But the systemic problem was that the key escort talent and hardware bled off to the big fleet front. Carriers, battleships, destroyers. Glory lived there, and doctrine too. Convoys were dirty work. Meanwhile, needs were growing. The war swallowed fuel and iron faster than the yards could repair and build. So even improvements in ASW didn't protect the arteries. They merely raised the cost of every barrel of oil in transit. More detours, longer passages, higher bunker consumption by escorts, and a smaller chance the cargo would arrive at all. On the roll call of names, 1943 was the year of innovative skippers. They pushed the craft's culture forward. Decisive night surface approaches, the end-around to set up a second salvo, short bursts into multiple targets minutes apart, quick dives and pop-ups to keep pressure on the convoy. In patrol reports, the despair of the early years faded. A cold economy arrived. Hit, broke contact, returned, finished. Boats coordinated more with one another and with shore, stopped losing targets in darkness and foul weather, and stopped fearing package attacks. By year's end, it all added up to arithmetic that made Tokyo grit its teeth. In the JANAC post-war assessment, Japan's merchant fleet lost about 1.5 million tons in 1943. In real time, that figure wasn't yet fully visible. The fog of war was thick, but the symptoms showed. Fewer tankers in each successive convoy, a rising share of small steamers on long routes, a shift of some traffic to coastal cabotage where it was supposedly safer, and where boats lay in wait at port approaches. Recovery lagged. Shipbuilding ran into shortages of raw materials and fuel, yards into bomb damage and a lack of steel, crews into training bottlenecks. The hole in tonnage ceased to be a statistic and became everyday life. Not enough barges to haul coal. Not enough tankers to cover a task force's needs. Not enough freighters to feed a distant garrison. We'll bridge it with a pause. A pause that sometimes stretched to hunger. War economies at sea rarely collapse in a single blow. In 1943, they split at the seams. Solving the torpedo problem multiplied every hit by the effect of intelligence. Wolfpacks turned chance opportunities into guaranteed contacts. SJ radar shifted the night to the hunter's side. The route's geography, nodes, straits, pockets, became a target map rather than a trader's guide. Japan, which had no surplus oil, lacked the luxury of a long buffer. Each sunk tanker was not just a tonnage loss, it was a floating warehouse removed from the frontline pipeline. The historical irony is that 1943 often cedes the limelight, in popular memory, to the big battles. Guadalcanal still smoldering, Tarawa thundering, carrier groups gearing up for the giant clashes to come. Yet it is in this year that the undersea war assembled an invisible dialectic of shortage. With each passing week, it became harder to replace merchant losses, costlier to deliver a ton of fuel, and shallower the industry's breathing. By January of the next year, the curves diverged for good. American boats entered 1944 as a mature blockade system, while Japanese logistics stood like a patient still on his feet but already gasping on every stair. That's why 1943 is called the turning point. It doesn't end the war along the sea roads, but it fixes its vector. After it, there's no longer any need to argue whether submarines work. The only task is to count how many months the enemy's economy can last under shrinking tonnage. The answer, as it soon turned out, was frighteningly few. Strangulation is the year when the submarine war stops being a task of harassing the rear and becomes the mechanics of systematic immobilization. In 1944, American boats hit their stride as a mature craft. The fixed Mark 14, a confident school of night surface attacks, SJ radar, and tight coordination via radio intelligence and shore-based brains. The result is record-sinking tonnage that doesn't just spoil Tokyo's stats, but methodically erases floating warehouses of oil and ore from the map. In a single year, Allied subs strip an estimated 2.7 million gross tons from Japan. By December, the merchant fleet shrinks to roughly 2.9 million tons of carrying capacity. That's not percentage points. That's oxygen in the lungs of the economy. The hunting map is rebuilt around strangling choke points. Boats lay a dense comb across the Luzon and Taiwan Straits, the South China Sea, the approaches to Formosa and the China coast. In 1943, they learned to keep a convoy on a leash. In 1944, they turn any passage into a multi-move trap. One boat intercepts the sailing signal. Another detects and reports the composition. A third swings ahead onto the track. And when the screen lunges to counterattack, the stragglers are finished off. SJ radar pushes back the night. The TDC spins solutions faster than a target can change its zigzag. The end-around, overtake, swing, and fire into the leader's beam, becomes routine. The enemy's ASW, stronger on paper, unravels in practice. Too few aircraft, too little radar, too little patience in pursuit. A convoy is an organism, and the blows fall on arteries and nerves. First the tankers go, then the columns control, then the escort's morale. The year's symbolic nerve is the Philippine Sea. On 19 June 1944, USS Kavala creeps up on the Super Fleet, and with a clean salvo sends the carrier Shōkaku to the bottom. Almost simultaneously, USS Albacore pierces Taihō. The seemingly invulnerable new Queen dies from torpedo damage and fire. With 2 shots, submariners knock out part of the Imperial Navy's air fist in a battle where the big forces expected glory. The episode matters beyond its effect. It shows that even deeply layered formations with air cover aren't safe from an invisible surface hunter in the night. From that day, even super task forces proceed with caution, and with extra fuel burned for maneuver and zigzagging, especially painful in the logistics famine of 1944. In the fall, the war reminds everyone again that the myth of the unsinkable battleship died long ago. On 21 November, USS Sea Lion catches Kongō in straighted waters and tears her open with a string of hits. The only Japanese battleship sunk by a submarine. It's a surgical jab at a doctrine that treated the battleship as the final argument of power. If even a floating fortress can't guarantee a safe passage, what can for a tanker? The answer is simple: nothing. Tankers become target number 1. Each one lost starts the countdown for aviation, fleet operations, and factories. Between these headline blows runs the routine, ruinous arithmetic. In the South China Sea and on the approaches to Formosa, Boats peel off convoys coming from Borneo and Sumatra.
Some cargoes are pushed into coastal cabotage, safer it seems, until submarines cut them at port entrances. Converted trawlers and escort destroyers can't run a marathon chase. Depth charges are still often set too shallow. Tropical thermoclines turn acoustics into a snowy blur. By night, the American radar sees first and farther, breaking the escort's key advantage, while contact. Strategically, 1944 is the collapse of imports. Oil from the Netherlands East Indies passes through a dwindling number of living tankers. Many are stuck on repair lists. The rest lie on straight bottoms. Ore and rubber arrive late and underloaded. Schedules break apart on shore when a plant gets coal but not fuel oil. Steel but not coke. Home island shipyards are overloaded, patching warships, assembling new escorts, fixing merchants, and digging out from bomb damage. The shipbuilding response can't keep up. Tonnage declines faster than replacements arrive. Each missing hull punches a hole not in a spreadsheet but in a specific program. Munitions delayed. Aircraft grounded for lack of fuel. Operations on peripheral fronts cut to the bone. In 1944, the psychology aboard subs changes too. This is no longer the luck of a daring skipper, but the craft of a crew. One boat takes contact and passes it through the net. Another works a target battery as the convoy enters a narrows. A third waits for the wood grouse, the straggler, repairing steering or hiding in a dawn cove. Commanders economize torpedoes but not resolve. Short series against the key nodes, tanker, leader, radio operator, and then down to depth, breaking away with a bloody trail of oil and bubbles to lure the screen onto false tracks. Patrol reports acquire a terse formula of maturity. Contact held, convoy dispersed, priority targets hit. Japan's ASW does what it can. More convoys, more purpose-built escorts, added patrols, attempts at radio information and traffic control. But the system starts late and feeds from the same shrinking pool. The best destroyers are tied to major operations. ASW aviation and fuel are in short supply. Radars and sonars are issued in patches. Personnel are exhausted and thinning. In such conditions, even correct decisions become expensive compromises. Longer routes, more zigzagging, higher fuel burn, and still the traps and straits, where the physics of geography outruns orders. The year is studded with other node episodes. Just before Leyte Gulf, submariners Darter and Dace carve up Kurita's heavy cruisers, sending Atago and Maya down and crippling Takao. Another illustration that strength on paper is one thing. A real-world transit is another. In the details lies the craft's sad dialectic. The same 1944 takes from the Americans the legendary Tang, lost to her own circular running torpedo. A reminder that the sea forgives neither success nor fatigue. Yet the strategic trend does not budge. Each week dents Japan's freight a little more. By year's end, the economic effect is indisputable. Oil and ore imports have fallen off a cliff. Low-calorie coal grows in the fuel mix. Aviation shifts to dry sortie allotments. The fleet limits training and deployment cruises. Army garrisons on the periphery, New Guinea, the Philippines, Burma, receive ever more intermittent supply. Seaborne trade, the empire's external bloodstream just yesterday, shrinks into coastal rat traffic. Small craft, barges, junks, night dashes along the shore. That's not a fix. It's a symptom of strangulation. By December 1944, the main truth is plain. The war on sea lanes has become a war on time. Japan's economy runs on a stretched rubber band. Every cargo takes longer. Every ship costs more per mile. Every barrel turns over less often. Submarines do exactly what the theory promised. They compress space and multiply friction, even if somewhere a convoy is assembled by the book. It lacks not only escorts but fuel. Not only fuel but time. And in 1944, time works exclusively for those under the water. That's the peak of the campaign. Headline torpedo kills, invisible night garrots in straits, widening holes in tanker and freighter ledgers, and final charts where the tonnage curve drops faster than the shipbuilding curve can rise. Beyond those curves lies 1945, when a mine noose will join the Submarine 1 and the blockade will become total. But already in 1944, the Empire is breathing through a straw, and the straw keeps snapping. Tailspin into collapse is the year when the Empire's logistics stop being a system
and turn into a set of desperate survival tricks.
After 1944, Japan's trade is breathing through a straw,
and in 1945 that straw is being chewed from both ends at once. Submarines on distant and coastal approaches, and aerial mines turning ports and straits into traps with invisible teeth.
The economy,
Already exhausted, enters a spiral in which each new turn isn't offset by resources, but only accelerates the fall. U.S. submarine forces open the year with a confident mesh of barriers.
intercept lines stretch across the entrances to the East China Sea,
The approaches to Formosa, the Luzon and Taiwan Straits, and the threads leading toward Shimonoseki and Tsushima.
the bet shifts.
Where large convoys on long routes used to be the main target, the hunt now slides toward the coastal rat traffic. The few surviving transports, fishing schooners, barges, junks, motor lighters, anything that can carry coal, rice,
Fuel oil, scrap metal.
move by night, avoid fairways, hug the coast, hide in coves and behind headlands.
That is exactly where the boats lie in wait.
SJ radar snatches dark silhouettes, intercepts provide the routes, and the shallow water overtake and cut tactic becomes a trade. A brief surface dash, a burst into the leading lighter transport, a breakaway to depth, another approach a few miles.
On, and finishing off the stragglers. Daylight fighting is less and less necessary.
The night has become the hunter's ally. Large ocean passages in 1945 almost cease. The tanker fleet is spent, repair funds torn open, shipyards jammed with warships, bomb damage, and steel shortages. Whatever still sails from Manchuria and Korea is steered through inland waters and protected straits, but there too the safe zone is gone. ASW, stronger on paper, can't keep up with the geometry of the threat.
There are specialized escorts, but not enough.
ASW aviation runs on starvation rations of fuel. Radar and acoustics arrive in patches. Pursuit after an attack is often short and vicious, while for a submarine it's enough to ride out a depth charge.
Run and slip back onto the convoy's course. The blow to coastal cabotage strikes at the very heart of supply.
Coal meant for power stations and railways doesn't arrive. Fish and rice meant for cities are delayed or rot at transshipment points. Wood fuel and firewood, mobilized as substitutes,
Can't cover the heat and energy deficits.
even that invisible garrote is only the first loop. Spring brings the second, Operation Starvation. B-29s, retrained from area bombing to the dirty work of mine laying, begin sowing magnetic, acoustic, and combination mines off Japan's shores.
From April through August,
More than 1,500 sorties and over 12,000 mines sown on the approaches to major ports, in straits, and across the bottlenecks of the inland sea.
Shimonoseki,
The Hanshin area, Kure, Sasebo, Moji, Osaka, and Kobe, the entrances towards Sendai and Hakodate. All the gates a nation must live through become probabilistic death. Mines don't just sink ships, they break routine.
Every voyage now starts with the question of whether the channel will explode under the wake of the lead ship.
Every captain and dispatcher must wait for sweeping, and there are too few sweepers, and they too are short of fuel.
The result is a paralysis of schedules.
As the fields thicken, losses and damage climb by the hundreds. Through Kobe, cargo flow falls by more than 80% from March to July.
This isn't a statistical dip.
It is a ban on the normal life of ports. The strategic power of the mining blockade lies in its lazy cruelty. A submariner must stalk, risk, maneuver. A mine simply lies in wait.
It needs no gasoline.
Leave, shift change. It knows no combat fatigue. It works night and day, in calm and fog. Even with competent sweeping, fear and pauses begin to rule the timetable. Minesweepers must go first, suffer first, and burn the very fuel the voyages were meant to bring, instead of one smooth cycle. Deliver, unload, return the empties. You get a jagged, stuttering cycle. Wait for a window, run through on a prayer, join the queue, hunt for a way back. Multiply that by hundreds of port operations and you get a country. That, in logistics, is no longer waging war, so much as pushing a boulder uphill. The collapse of transport in 1945 drags a chain of secondary disasters behind it. Power plants shut down for lack of coal and fuel oil. Distribution grids switch to rolling blackouts. Railways cut timetables and grind down locomotives on low-grade fuel.
Fishing collectives hardly put to sea.
No fuel, and the mines frighten them off. Agriculture loses fertilizers and tractor fuel, and the harvest reaches the cities poorly.
Steel and non-ferrous output drops for lack of ore and coke, and much of what is smelted lacks a delivery leg.
Military programs, from aviation to the fleet, subsist on patched-up leftovers. Some things get assembled, some finished, but scale and close,
Tempo are out of step with frontline needs. Peripheral garrisons,
from New Guinea to Burma and the remnants in the Philippines, are cut off halfway. Battalion rations shrink to company shares. Fuel is replaced by empty cans and orders to hold out. Logistical strangulation changes enemy
behavior as well. Japan spins up an economy of desperation,
converting fishing boats and launches into night mule trains, prioritizing coastal cabotage, building small simplified series escorts, throwing in motor torpedo boats and suicide craft, devising
through routes across the inland sea. But every improvisation hits the same dilemma.
To move more often and more safely, you need more fuel, more sweeping, more protection. And there is less of all of it each month. By summer, the improvisation is spent. Inertia remains.
There is a symbolic prologue to the 1945 water road impunity.
On 29 November 1944, USS Archerfish catches, at night, the transitioning, poorly sea-readied and overloaded carrier giant Shinano, and sends her to the bottom.
It is the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine,
and the surreal sting of the episode is that the loss happens at home, under the cover of the home islands, where, supposedly, everything is nearby and under control.
Shinano becomes a monument to the chief illusion.
Proximity to one's own shores is not safety. In 1945, this truth becomes everyday life for every captain running to Kobe, Osaka Bay, or the Shimonoseki Gates.
In sketches of possible endings, many contemporaries and some historians later argued that blockade alone would, with time, have sufficed for capitulation.
Mines plus submarines, without invasion.
It's a working hypothesis, and its logic reads in the curves.
Cargo flow falling, fuel exhausted, plants stopping, army supply jerking, urban hunger looming.
But real history offers no clean experiment.
To the submarine and mine noose are added the mass fires of strategic bombing, atomic strikes, and the Soviet entry into the war.
One way or another, 1945 shows the limits of resilience of an island empire dependent on sea roads.
When the sea stops being a road and becomes a field of traps, the state lives from one narrow window to the next, and one day discovers there are no windows left. So tailspin into collapse isn't a figure of speech, but a chart.
Submarines drive external and coastal shipping down to a minimum,
tearing out the big links and endlessly grinding the small. Operation Starvation strips meaning from port geography, murdering the predictability of time and routes.
By autumn, the economy moves only in lunges.
By winter, it hardly moves at all.
And when, in the war's last months,
the fleet and air force need a miracle, logistics can offer only another pause in the schedule, one more dawn sweeping run, and a prayer that the invisible mine stays silent yet again.
The final chart of this war looks simple and merciless.
The line of Japan's tonnage crawls downward like a depressurized gauge, while the line of American successes keeps climbing and never lets go. According to post-war JANAC summaries and U.S.
Navy estimates,
Allied submarine forces sent about 4.78 to 5.58 million tons of merchant shipping to the bottom, roughly 55% of all Japanese losses.
Add to that about 540,000 tons of warships,
and the overall tally lands between roughly 1,100 and 1,390 ships, depending on counting methods, duplicate claims, and post-war corrections.
The spread doesn't change the core conclusion.
Submarines weren't an add-on to victory. They became its structural mechanism, the Archimedean screw which, braced on seawater and invisibility, lifted entire enemy war plans into the realm of the
impossible.
How it worked is visible in the details. As an instrument of war, the submarine is cheaper than a battleship or carrier, not only in money and steel mass, but in human capital. U.S. subs employed only fractions of a percent of the fleet's manpower, yet forced Imperial Japan to reallocate everything it could at sea, and to the least glamorous task, protecting merchant traffic.
In the ideal world of staff officers, this is called
the overhead cost of security. In reality, It's a chain of constant compromises. Every destroyer pulled from a battle group into escort duty is one fewer blade in the future decisive clash. Every patrol aircraft sent to hunt periscopes is one fewer sortie against shore targets, and fewer fuel hours for training. Every extra mile of zigzag is one less barrel of fuel oil you can spend later. Submarines compelled the system not to make a one-off decision, but to pay interest forever on the debt of fear. Japan's ASW system objectively lost the race to the maturation of American submarine doctrine. The convoy, as a way of life, emerged late and was as thin as post-war bread. Escorts were scarce, and the best units were constantly pulled to the front of glory with the carriers and battleships. ASW aviation was limited, and its eyes, radar and acoustics, remained patchy and imperfect. Japanese radar sets lagged in range and stability. Fuel shortages cut long patrols, and pursuit after an attack usually ended with a short and vicious string of depth charges followed by a return to the column. Meanwhile, step by step, the Americans normalized what in 1942 still looked audacious: night surface attacks, radar queuing, coordinated groups, end-arounds to gain a firing lead, radio contact sharing with elements of centralized dispatch. The fixed Mark 14 turned hit statistics from a lottery into a craft, and a craft, replicated across dozens of boats and hundreds of patrols, inevitably breaks any average convoy. The home island's industry couldn't plug the breach. In theory, merchant losses are offset by new construction, repairs, and mobilization of captured or civilian vessels. In practice, all three columns stumbled. Building got harder. Steel, coke, electricity, and above all, petroleum products went to military programs and to fighting fires after raids. Repair became an endless queue. Damaged merchants stood in dry docks beside warships, and the yards throbbed with alerts and bomb damage. Mobilizing everything that floats eventually swelled small-scale cabotage, but that growth was feverish. Many units, little dead weight, poor seaworthiness, high vulnerability to mines and night attacks near shore. The result is obvious. Tonnage shrank faster than replacements arrived, and the average size and quality of the ships in service fell. The empire shifted from a linear deficit to an exponential nuisance. Fragmented decision-making worsened the physics of defeat. The Navy and the Ministry of Commerce looked at the same ships through different lenses. The Navy demanded discipline and escorts. The commercial side demanded the fastest possible export of coal, rice, ore, and fuel in any hull still afloat. Arguments over routes, fuel allocation, and cargo priority dragged on for weeks and were settled in favor of the hottest sector, which might not be hottest tomorrow. On a horizon of such bureaucratic viscosity, even good decisions arrived late. Convoys sailed after the threat's peak. Escorts were assembled from whatever was at hand. Sweeping plans and port defenses lagged the minefields. Any stability of schedules vanished, and without stable schedules, infrastructure loses not only efficiency, but meaning. The socio-economic end came like a logistical cold that turned into inflammation of the whole body. By early 1945, the remaining tonnage was near minimum, and it was physically felt. Electricity flickered and died. Railways withered to skeletal timetables. Locomotives suffered on low-grade fuel. Cities blackened with soot and empty deliveries. Even when the harvest came in, it didn't reach tables in the needed volume and rhythm. Fishing slumped under minefields and fuel shortages. Light industry halted not only for lack of raw materials, but because there was no delivery arm for finished goods. Military programs became a catalog of open items. Aircraft without gasoline, ships without voyages, munitions without timely shipment. Outlying garrisons slipped to hunger rations, and the bridges of supply in Southeast Asia and the islands crumbled into a set of accidents, where every voyage was a separate feat and a separate roll of the dice. Crucially, submarines didn't win by miracle. They won by disciplined minutiae. Intercept the schedule. Make a night visual contact under radar. Compute the solution on the move. Fire a short series at the priority target. Choose the right escape depth. Wait patiently for the second window at dawn. This isn't a heroic myth. It's technologized routine, and routine multiplies effect. When hundreds of such episodes stack month after month, an economy built on uninterrupted flows can't survive discontinuity. Production loves rhythm. Logistics loves predictability. Submarine warfare takes both away. You can argue whether a sea blockade alone would have forced capitulation without invasion and atomic strikes. History offers no clean experiments, but even a skeptic must admit. By the summer of 1945, logistical strangulation was a sufficient condition for systemic paralysis. B-29 mines disfigured port and strait entrances, making the calendar work against trade, while submarines finished what slipped through. That two-handed choke cut oxygen to both front and rear. In the end, a state that lived on sea roads was pushed back to the geography of an island, where every sack of rice and every barrel of fuel oil has not an abstract but a brutally concrete price. So, how exactly did submarines strangle the empire? They made the enemy pay in fuel and time for every meter traveled. They turned the convoy from a form of order into a form of risk. They jammed a ratchet into the trading wheel. No rolling back, ever more effort to go forward. They broke the economic synchronization between mine, smelter, yard, airfield, and front. And above all, they did it methodically and at scale, so that no one-off, heroic operation could restore breath. By August, only clinical gestures remained. Sweeping on a prayer at dawn, night scurries between minefields, sudden holes in timetables. But clinic is not strategy. Strategy ended earlier, when an invisible, small, and cheap force made a large, loud, and expensive machine live in spasms. In that difference lies the meaning of the submarine war. It does not so much destroy the enemy as deprive him of the habit of continuity. And without continuity, an industrial empire has neither a punch nor a breath.